Our second speaker in this session is Robert Barker, who's the Market Insights Analyst for North America, Middle East and North Africa and Korea for Meat and Livestock Australia. So Robert regularly gets into the analysis of these markets for the Australian red meat industry in a great deal of detail, so I'm sure he'll have some insights as well about this region and the role that it plays in terms of Australian agricultural exports. So thanks, Robert.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Mick Keogh and the Australian Farm Institute for the invitation to come and speak to you today. And thanks for finishing up, Susanna, before the lamb topic, because that's exactly what I'm going to be speaking about for the next 20 minutes. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Europe, so it's not entirely Middle East today. And I will be talking about opportunities and obstacles for the Australian sheep and lamb industry in these two markets. First of all, a quick overview as to what MLA does. I'm sure a lot of you already know, but just in case there's a couple of people that aren't familiar with us. Meat and Livestock Australia is a producer-owned company that provides research and development and on-farm and off-farm marketing of red meat, both in Australia and around the world, to promote consumption, and market access advice, which is probably one of the most important topics for today in particular. So this is on behalf of the Australian sheep, cattle and goat producers who fund MLA through their levies, and on behalf of the government, which matches some of the R&D dollars as well. So as I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about two of Australia's most important lamb and mutton markets, Europe and the Middle East. And these are important in different ways. The Middle East is probably our largest market by volume, by some distance, when you combine lamb, mutton and live sheep as well. And Europe is probably our most valuable market on a unit basis. It's a much smaller market by volume, but the amount of the returns that the industry gets for each kilogram that's exported to Europe is very high. MLA actually has offices in Brussels and in Dubai, which coordinate the market access and marketing activities in those two regions. So what I'll do today is have a brief look at the past, what's happened over the last couple of decades, how that's brought us to where we are today, and what might come up down the track, and that'll include both potential opportunities for us and a few things that are in the way that we'll need to overcome to get there. First of all, though, why we've been successful in the past as lamb and mutton exporter. So we've got different reasons for different regions, but we do export to over 100 countries around the world, so we are obviously a viable lamb and mutton option for buyers around the world. In the EU, key things include environmental sustainability, animal welfare, the quality of the product, shelf life and safety, and the fact that it complements EU production in terms of their seasonality with the northern and southern production systems. Middle East, trusted halal certification is probably the most important thing that gets us into most of the markets there. The fact that it's clean and safe food that they can trust, and the regular availability of the product. I said it complements EU, but we do have year-round production as well, so we can meet demand in other markets around the world. So in the slides ahead, I'm going to be looking at ways that we can try to maximise our returns to the industry. So there's a few good things, a few bad things in various markets, but try to look at it from the perspective of maximising the returns to the sheep and lamb industry in Australia. So in the EU, we've had a historical connection, particularly through the UK, and this was extended to the EU through the accession of the UK to the economic community in the 1970s. Used to be a focus on wool, which is part of the reason why we have the quota in place at the moment for lamb, mutton and goat meat. And as you can see, over the last 20 years, the volume hasn't actually changed in terms of our sheep meat exports to the EU. but over that time the value has increased by over 140%. Part of that, admittedly, is nominal values, and there are differences in exchange rates from year to year, but the value of the product has increased over time while the volumes remain steady. And when you've got a quota sitting there at just under 20,000 tonnes, that's your reason. But on the other side of things, with the Middle East and North Africa, you can see over the last 20 years, the volumes increased 200%. It's from 40,000 tonnes 20 years ago to 120,000 tonnes in 2014. So we've had a presence, the Australian sheep and lamb industry has had a presence in market there for almost 50 years. The live trade's been active since the 1970s. We've had a long-term box trade with the UAE in particular, and we've had other markets come in and out over time, but over the last 10 years in particular, we've seen a huge expansion across the region. We are still particularly focused on the Gulf Cooperation Council countries that Susanna was talking about, but you can see there has been a huge increase in volumes and values over the last 20 years. So where are we today? In the EU, we're in the same position we've been for the last 40 years. The quota arrangements haven't changed. Might not be the same for everybody, but that's a fair bit longer than I've been alive. There hasn't been a revision to the way that quota's been administered over there. Besides some small changes when new countries enter the EU, there's a small increase. I think we got an extra 400 tonnes a couple of years ago when a couple more countries joined the EU. It is a high-value market. Majority of the product that's exported there is lamb legs and shanks, and the UK is by far the largest individual market. There is strong demand in the region, but that quota restricts us from capitalising on it. The Middle East, on the other hand, really adds value to the Australian sheep industry by taking everything. The most popular product in the Middle East is a chilled lamb carcass, which over the last couple of years has really increased with that air freight capability that's developed with Emirates Etihad, Qatar Airways. Frozen mutton carcasses are also popular, but the best thing is, besides the whole carcass and the live trade, the markets in the Middle East will take everything. There's a whole suite of cuts they'll take, as well as offal products. So this is very important for the Australian sheep industry. And just a reminder of how big the Middle East is for our exporters. Leg exports to the Middle East, even though whole carcass makes up 65%, the volume of leg that's exported to the Middle East is more than the total volume of lamb and mutton that is exported to the EU in a year. The live trade is still very important, particularly for Western Australia. There's almost 2 million head of lambs exported there every year. It's not as large as it used to be, but it is still a very important part of the industry. Now to have a bit of a split to look at each region individually. First of all, the EU, looking at a few things that might be good to help us grow our sheep and lamb exports to the EU. So it's all about access at the moment. There is demand for the product, but with the quota in place at the moment, it does make it extremely difficult and expensive if anybody wants to increase their trade. So for the sheep industry, improved access to the EU is probably the #1 priority at the moment. The industry has been pushing this for a long time, but we do need the business side and the commercial drivers behind it to continue to impress upon government that it is somewhere that we need to improve. And the EU has been identified as being important, but it's a potentially very long process before that does improve. As I mentioned, we've got this 19,186 tonne quota. For people unfamiliar with the sheep industry, that might seem like quite a lot. You think 19,000 tonnes, 19, 20 kilos a lamb, that's 1 million lambs a year that we're, that much worth of lamb that we're sending to the EU. But you have to remember it's across lamb, mutton and goat, and then when you compare it to New Zealand, It's virtually nothing. New Zealand has a 227,000 tonne quota. Even Argentina has a larger quota to the EU than us. So, as I mentioned, this system's never been reviewed, so it is something that we'll continue to push for the sheep industry to try and improve. So, if we do get this improvement into Europe of access, where's the growth? As I mentioned earlier, the majority of what we send to the EU goes to the UK. But because of the small volumes, we can't develop large relationships with the bigger retailers, the Tesco's, the Sainsbury's, the growing cheaper supermarkets like Aldi and Lidl, Carrefour in continental Europe, and even the smaller supermarkets. I say smaller, but they're still large. Marks and Spencer, the higher end supermarkets. It is difficult to build a relationship when you can't guarantee that somebody else might export and take up part of the quota volume. As it stands at the moment, most of what we export, the legs and shanks, will end up in food service, and it's pubs and restaurants and the odd boutique butcher. But the local pub isn't going to say Australian lamb shank on the menu, it'll just be a lamb shank, and Europe will continue to think of lamb as being either English or Welsh or possibly Irish, but more likely New Zealand lamb. Australia won't get recognised. So the ability to develop those relationships with the larger retailers is very important to the industry. So at the moment, we might have a bit of opportunistic selling based on time of year if they happen to be short and need product. But again, it often leads to differentiation in the size of the product, the quality of the product, because the specifications haven't been fed through the supply chain, back through the processor and to the farmer at the starting point. Now, is there actually enough demand to justify this? We do conduct surveys on a fairly regular basis based on through our Brussels office of importers. At the end of last year, importers were suggesting they could quite easily take another 50% volume of lamb and mutton compared to what they're taking at the moment. The importers that aren't currently importing Australian lamb would actually have the option to do so. So again, that access just means more opportunities to export the product, to market the product. Wouldn't necessarily be a switch overnight, but it does give us the opportunity, as a lot of people mentioned yesterday. It's the access that is key, and then on a commercial basis, we're able to take advantage of it. As an example, beef has actually got quite an improved level of access over the last couple of years with the high-quality grain-fed and grass-fed quotas. The high-quality beef grain-fed quota has actually increased threefold in the last 4 years, from under 4,000 tonnes a few years ago to looking like it'll hit 15,000 tonnes this year. So there is real potential for high-value product to continue to grow into Europe. It is a strong market. I mentioned the UK is our largest market individually. There's 500 million people across the EU. When you take 19,000 tonnes of lamb and mutton that we're exporting to the EU every year, it works out at 38 grams per person per year. That's it's not even a chop each. So there is a lot of potential, particularly when overall consumption of lamb and mutton is 2 kilograms per person. There is potential there to increase market share. European production is expected to decline in future, but the change in population mix isn't expected to result in people wanting less mutton, lamb and mutton. If anything, it's going to result in people wanting more. Growing Muslim population is a traditional sheep meat eating population, and they're not competing with pork, which is probably the most consumed red meat over there. So, on to the Middle East and North Africa now. As Susanna mentioned, the GCC free trade agreement would be great. 5% though is not the largest barrier we're facing around the world. What we would love to see is better access through the removal of non-tariff barriers. Across the Middle East, it's estimated that technical barriers to trade cost the Australian red meat industry $360 million a year. That's not just lamb and mutton, that's beef as well and offal. But $360 million a year is a huge amount. The reason I've got chilled shelf life here, we've got the science behind our lamb being able to last for 12 weeks for chilled shelf life. A lot of countries in the Middle East, there are restrictions as low as 6 weeks. We can't take advantage of the advances we've made in our science and the way we use our products and develop our products. So one of the things we're trying to get increased at the moment is a few countries have a restriction of 40 days chilled entry into the country and then total of 70 days before it can't be sold anywhere at all. So the first restriction is the 40 days and then on top of that the 70 days in retail. So we're aiming to get that up to 90 days. Just gives the retailers that little bit of extra time to work with and a little bit more confidence that the exporters at the Australian end can build up the product and make sure that the volumes are efficiently moved across. There are other technical barriers, things like document legalisation that needs to be done through embassies. There's a cost per container of product and a cost per page of documentation. And this can quickly add up with the huge volumes that we're exporting to the Middle East. Some countries require a temperature probe in the container to make sure, well, to read what the temperature changes are as the transport occurs. Iraq requires supervision of the loading of the container by an external inspection company. In Saudi Arabia, there's a need to separate offal from your primal meat cuts. They can't be shipped in the same container. They might be well wrapped in plastic bags, vacuum packed, different boxes, different pallets. That's not okay. It has to be in a different container. All of these things add cost to what we're doing. There's also a couple of countries outside the GCC where we do have huge duties. Morocco was mentioned by Susanna at 200%. Turkey's also over 200% for some products. These sorts of things really stand in the way of increasing the volume and the value returns that we can generate in the Middle East. So again, if we do get this improved access, where's the growth? There are still opportunities. We've got wealthy nationals across the region. It's relatively slow growing population when I get to the next couple of groups, which are the wealthy expats and tourists and the construction sector, which it goes hand in hand with the wealthy expats and tourists. And all of these groups are actually predisposed to eating sheep meat. And of the wealthy people from overseas that aren't, a lot of them might be convinced to eat sheep meat. It's a relatively expensive product in some cases, so there's a bit of conspicuous consumption that goes on across the region. So what we're looking at over the next few years, particularly I'm going to focus on the tourism and expat sector here. Dubai, as one example, is expecting to build 100 new hotels by the end of the decade. That's a huge number of people that will be coming through the region, potentially purchasing extra Australian lamb and mutton. Once they've completed their second airport and it's running at full capacity, they're expecting 100 million passengers per year through the 2 airports in Dubai. And it's not just tourism, it's feeding or getting food into the airlines, into the shops at the airports. It's just getting that image built and finding new customers, looking outside the box a little bit. But the other thing is we can't forget our competitors. China and India export lamb and mutton into the Middle East. New Zealand exports lamb and mutton into the Middle East. And they're all capable of sending in very good products. So it's not just a given that Australia will be the place that supplies all of this. East Africa for live sheep as well does compete. But again, besides the direct exports, there's the potential to work with foreign partners. one of the things that Australian agriculture needs is investment in the industry to make sure that we can continue to supply year-round. There's enough money going in to generate the product that can go out and bring money back in. Hassard is an example of an investment in long-term food security, but it's not just a blank cheque from the Qatar government. It does require a commercial return. So there are opportunities for proving that Australian agriculture can generate a return. And whether or not that comes from Australian sources or overseas sources, that's another example. I've got charity here, so I'm not saying that our exporting companies need to donate a container of lambs or a container of mutton, although that can and does happen in some places to generate goodwill. What this is referring to is the increasing and increasingly westernised populations in the Middle East. At certain times of the year, particularly around religious festivals, there's an expectation that the wealthy in particular will donate a part of their food to less well-off parts of the community. Traditionally, this would be taking a lamb home to slaughter themselves and then dividing it amongst the community. This might not be able to go on so long. We've had interest from charitable organisations in the Middle East coming to Australia and saying, we'd like the sheep and the lambs processed in Australia. We'll buy them and we'll have people at the other end of the supply chain buying the lambs and using these ones that you've processed as part of their charitable work. So that's just another opportunity for thinking outside the box. But I think I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at saying there is a huge market for lamb and mutton around the world, but we really do need access to it to make the most of it. So, thank you.